Welcome to All About Art. My name is Alexandra, and I'm an art historian, curator, and writer. Within this podcast, topics relating to art history, cultural policy, the art sector, as well as a large range of other art-related topics will be covered. Conducting critical discussions, having entertaining exchanges, or just enjoying some relaxing chats, All About Art is where you'll find it all. Join me in exploring and developing cultural discourse. Welcome to another episode of All About Art. In this episode, I sat down with Jo Lawson-Tancred, author of AI and the Art Market, a book recently published as part of the Hot Topics in the Art World series by Lund Humphries and Sotheby's Institute of Art. The book offers an approachable introduction to AI for art market professionals, considering AI's impact on and possible applications within the art world, whether as a business tool or as an artistic medium. I speak to Jo about the facets she explores in her book as she writes about the many different ways AI can be implemented in the arts. So we discussed how she approached it. I asked her about what led to her even starting to think about merging the fields of AI and art. We chat about how different artists are working with the technology, what she foresees in the future of AI and technological advancements, and so much more. Thank you, Jo, for coming on the podcast. And thank you to Lund Humphries for the collaboration. Before we dive into the episode, I want to take a minute of your time to mention that All About Art is on Patreon. We are mostly volunteer-led, but in order to cover running costs and other expenses, we make it possible for our lovely listeners to support us, ranging from £1 a month to the price of an oat latte a month, or on the higher end, the price of a Sunday brunch per month, depending on the tier you want to choose. If every person who listens to the podcast signed up for the £1 tier on our Patreon, we would be able to sustain the podcast while also having scope to produce episodes more frequently and expand our activities in demystifying the professional arts sector. So, if you want to receive early access to episodes and behind-the-scenes content, maybe you want to get some merch, or if you just love what we do and want to support us, I would be thrilled if you considered signing up. The link to the Patreon is in the show notes. Also, thank you to our sponsors at Synergy Associates, the art world tech gurus, for supporting this episode's production at their clubhouse on Pall Mall. You can find more about Synergy and their facilities in the show notes. And now, on to the interview. Welcome to the podcast, Jo.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on.
To start us off, I would love for you to tell listeners about your background. You have a degree in art history, as well as a degree in data science and machine learning. Firstly, what had sparked your interest in art? And then, what led you to seek out such a different subject for your second degree? Did you always want to merge the two?
Well, so my interest in art came about, I liked history, and I think the social history aspect of art is what drew me to history of art. I think some people come at it from a love of painting and how paint looks on the canvas and those aspects, which I also like, but it was very much the context around art making that compelled me to study history of art, which I did at the Courtauld. And at that time, tech or AI or any of these things was not on my mind at all.
When was this that you went to the Courtauld?
I did my BA there from 2014 to 2017. And also it wasn't such a big part of the conversation then. So after graduating, I was in that panic that everyone has about what they're going to do. And one thing that was going quite well for me is I'd started doing a few reviews for Apollo magazine. And so while I was getting nowhere with interviews for jobs, I briefly wanted to work in TV or literary agencies that support script writers. But writing about art was going quite well, so I was carrying on with that, but it didn't really feel like a safe life plan.
I get that.
I got told by a teacher at the Courtauld, your writing's quite good, have you ever considered journalism? And I remember completely dismissing the thought, like I didn't give it 5 minutes. I was like, what an absurd suggestion, because all you ever would hear about was death of journalism, there's no hope, so I'd never even considered that.
Wow.
Yeah. And then...
look at you now.
It's really like kind of emerged out of it just continually each year more surprised that it's actually turned out to be a possibility. But so yeah, I was writing for Apollo, but I kind of felt like I needed a different plan. And my dad is really into science, and I think he wanted... I mean, I think in another world, he would have been delighted with a child who had just studied science anyway. And he was like, there's this thing called big data. It's going to be a really big deal, even in the art world. So he encouraged me to do this course at Birkbeck. So they do evening courses in data science, and it's a conversion course. So you didn't need to have a background in even, I don't think you'd have to do kind of maths for A-level, which I hadn't, so thank God. But yeah, and then I had to learn coding in Python and do a bit of programming, which I haven't done for years. But I actually did do a little earlier this year. We were working with data ahead of the Venice Biennale. ArtNet put out a data dive on stats about the artists because they're much older than usual. Many more of them were dead than usual, all this kind of stuff. And I got out my Python and made a code so that we could
analyze that data.
Yeah, analyze the data.
That's
basically.
So cool.
Yeah.
Honestly, the art world is so behind when it comes to that. And I'm going to be really honest and straightforward about that. I'm not going to beat around the bush. That is so cool that you did that because it's so useful to have that data, to be able to not only, if you have it available to you, that information, to be able to then, I guess, process it in a way that you're able to have a holistic overview is so valuable.
Totally. And I'd read a lot of stuff online and people were like, it feels like this. It seems like there's been such an emphasis on dead artists, which was true in the main exhibition, Foreigners Everywhere. But it was nice to just really be able to show, because we'd compare proportion of dead artists and then by decade in which those that were alive were born, and then compared it to the past two editions before that. And you could see a really dramatic change. But yeah, to be able to show that rather than
be it feels this way, to be able to really back it up with quantifiable
completely
data.
And also it's quite fun. I coding actually is a bit like writing in a way. I think when you're writing in a journalistic sense, you have all this information that you need to make sense of, and then it's kind of like a puzzle to put it in the right place. And working out what you want to do and then working out the code you need to do to make it happen is actually quite fun. It's like a little puzzle solving exercise. So, but I haven't on the whole done a huge amount of coding or programming. I did study it on the course, and I studied machine learning as my kind of option. But at that time I was like, well, maybe there'll be more jobs that kind of involve a knowledge of art and coding. And then kind of the journalism took off more, and I was like, okay, this is actually working out. But also everyone now is obsessed with tech and AI, and there need to be people who cover this stuff and follow it. So it all kind of worked out really perfectly. And I remember when I started doing the course, it was in 2018, and people were just sort of shocked, and it seemed like a really absurd thing to do and such a weird U-turn. And now, obviously, you can't move without people talking about AI. So it suddenly makes sense. But I guess my dad was right about that one.
Yeah. We are recording this episode to, I guess, celebrate the publication of your book, AI and the Art Market. It's a book within the series Hot Topics in the Art World, published by Lund Humphries and Sotheby's Institute of Art. And there would be too much to cover in this episode if we talked about all of the facets that your book offers. So I wanted to start off with some of the terms that you mention in the introduction of the book, including AI and its slight difference to generative AI, and computer vision, or maybe also what you just mentioned, machine learning, without taking too much time. I would love it if you could give a bit of insights into these terms to ensure that our listeners understand, when we're talking about these things and when you refer to these things, what they really mean within the context of your book.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, because it's an introduction kind of aimed at art professionals who don't necessarily have a background, I wanted to keep it quite simple. So I mainly use the term AI, but I acknowledge that that's an umbrella that could refer to many different things. But AI, broadly speaking, is able to learn from data. So anything we feed into it, it can learn something from that. Maybe that means it can predict something that we want it to predict. But when we give it new data, because it understands from the past data, or it can spot a style, maybe spot a pattern in something, pattern recognition that we can't see in a group or a cluster of data. So over time, it's learning something that's hopefully helpful to us. And I didn't want to get too in the weeds of different types of AI, but there were a couple that were just super relevant to the context of the book. So one was computer vision, which is basically the ability for it to pick up meaningful information from a visual input. Computer vision has obvious applications, and I talk about it in the context of authenticating art. But art historians, I think, in niche projects, have been working with computer scientists to further their aims through computer vision, which I think is a very interesting area. Generative AI, I think that's one of the... Generative AI is perhaps what people think about when they think about AI, because it's become such a huge part of the conversation. And I think usefully so, because I've spoken to people whose lives are talking about this stuff, and they say it's so much easier now to talk to people about AI because they just have a bit more understanding, because generative AI has introduced them to some of the concepts. So it doesn't feel like they're starting from scratch, trying to explain what AI is every time.
Yeah. And so when we talk about the use of AI within the context of art, there are many ways in which it can be integrated. And one of them is, in that practical sense of, for example, spotting the difference, potentially authenticating a work of art, or somehow placing it within a context that we would otherwise maybe have more difficulty, placing it within. Another is with art creation itself, which is also really interesting to discuss. And a third that you mention in the book is the analytical side of things, which is useful when it comes to assessing the art market. So can you touch on these three kind of facets a little bit more, and maybe tell listeners how you decided to approach each one of these things within the book?
Yeah, so it deals very broadly with two different topics. One is how AI might be adopted within business practices in the market, so by art professionals themselves, or a service offered to art professionals. And that was, under that umbrella, is authentication, the possible uses for authenticating art. And the other would be valuation, or at least analysing art market data in new ways using AI. And there are other ways, but I thought those were the most two interesting case studies that kind of show the pros and cons. And obviously, ChatGPT, all these things, art businesses are using AI, but those felt quite specific to the aims of the art market and the topics that are maybe on people's minds at the moment in terms of how to make things more transparent or to open things up. So that was sort of one half of the book. And then the second half of the book is it deals with AI art, but it deals with it from the perspective of market professionals, so gallerists mostly, I suppose. When you have AI art, which is something a lot of people don't know about, but you're trying to perhaps build a market for or expand collector interest, how do you present that work? And obviously what we kind of dread is the idea of a room full of screens and impenetrable things that are difficult to engage with. So I wanted to draw in some examples of where I think really effectively contemporary art galleries were launching AI artists who might be really well known within the world of AI but aren't really outside of it, and kind of finding ways to transmit and make engaging their work, and also the programming that they do around it to elevate it and build that kind of historical context that's needed to I suppose, give it market value, but also make it interesting. So there's that. And then also I talk a bit about Web3 and the influence that that's had, the NFT boom and the different ways that artists could look to build a market or sell their work, which often kind of bridges Web3 with the traditional art world.
But I would actually love to hear your opinion on the latest happenings in the market, along with potentially the NFT boom, because NFTs are not really something that I've spoken to people about on the podcast before. I think because number one, there was not enough knowledge, at least also from my end, to feel comfortable talking about them. And also two, at the time when it came to the programming for the episodes, I didn't find it as relevant as other topics. However, in this case, especially with someone who has such, a unique background with art history and data science, having just written this book, I would really, really love to hear your opinion on, NFTs, the market, and how that is sort of looking in, I guess, the more art business, art sales, commercial art world side of things.
Yes, well, I think everyone is understandably quite tired of the idea of NFTs, and in a way they've become almost laughable because there was so much hype, and then obviously there was the crypto winter, although who knows what will happen now that Bitcoin is surging after Trump's victory, so we'll see what happens with that. But I like to think, I think it's very easy to note the downfall of NFTs, but what's interesting is to compare the state of the market for anything that could be classed as digital art really prior to NFTs. And I was talking to Mila Askarova, who's director of Gazelle Art House, which I talk to them quite a lot in the book because they have a really interesting program that combines digital art with traditional art. I mean, they don't combine it, I should say, but they hold exhibitions of both. So they don't see that it has to be siphoned off as some separate, weird part of a market that can't be shown in the same context as traditional art. But yes, I was speaking to her, and she's been working for years trying to create a market for digital art. And she was saying that in 2015, she went to the Silicon Valley Art Fair, which only existed for one edition.
I was going to say, I don't think I've ever heard of that.
No, I don't think it made a splash. She said no one bought anything. And people did go. Silicon Valley types turned up and they would ask questions because they were interested in the back end of things and how it worked. But I guess the culture to buy art was so kind of absent that no one bought anything. And I remember like a few mega galleries tried to set up galleries in San Francisco, I think, and those would all kind of close quite soon after. So there's been an attempt to court Silicon Valley money and convert that into potential collectors that really wasn't working at all. And then entering in 2021 NFTs, it's easy now to underestimate how much that changed the conversation. The fact that I'm really talking about it at all when it truly, there wasn't really a market. And now it's still difficult for digital artists to make a living, for sure. And Jake Elwes, who I spoke to, they said they still make most of their money from museums. They've had a lot of success institutionally because their practice is so interesting, and they've been acquired by the V&A and ZKM in Germany. So, you know, they are able to sustain themselves through their work, but it's not really the market that's playing a key role in that yet. I think it's important to acknowledge also for any artist, whether digital or not, it takes a long time to build a sustainable market. And obviously the NFT hype wasn't a sustainable market. So the fact that there, you know, it hasn't been an overnight fix and now everyone's spending loads of money on digital art doesn't mean that a market can't be emerging for digital art practices. People wanted an assurance of quality. They want some kind of filter, some kind of critical elevation of the work that they're going to spend lots of money on. But what has emerged out of that and, you know, is still evolving is hybrid platforms that take from Web3, but, you know, are also traditional art. They have that prestige and are able to bestow that prestige. So an obvious example is Christie's. I mean, Sotheby's, I believe, has Metaverse. And then Christie's has Christie's 3.0. So there are platforms where they sell digital art. And I was just thinking about it the other day. And if you'd said in 2000, and even 2020, I think that was kind of before the NFT boom, in less than 5 years, Christie's is going to have an online website where it sells AI-generated art. That would have sounded absurd. So I think that shows that how seriously people are taking it and how fast things have progressed since then. So, you know, it's hard. You can't forecast the future. But speaking to Mila about Silicon Valley Art Fair made me appreciate that this is a conversation at all and that there are platforms dedicated to marketing and selling digital art is a huge step.
Yeah. I wonder how collectors are displaying that art, if they sort of think that, or like if they have like a screen at home. So have you spoken to collectors about how they display or why they collect digital art, like these Silicon Valley types?
Well, I wanted to. It was quite hard, actually, to do that. Jake said to me when I spoke to them for the book that they had gone to install a work at a collector's home who is really into digital art and tech, and they did have sort of screens on the wall.
Okay.
So I think there are some people who do that. I do think to broaden appeal, it probably helps to have a physical manifestation. I know like Tyler Hobbs, who was huge in the NFT space, possibly the biggest success story really from a more fine art background rather than avatars. He last spring, well, in 2023, had two shows concurrently, one at Unit London and one at Pace, that were both very much inspired by the generative art that he'd been making by a computer, but instead using almost, I guess, like an analog version of the same principles, which I think he'd wanted to do. And so for him, it was great because he built this audience through NFTs and then was able to do this new project, which kind of explored the same ideas on canvas. But I would imagine from the gallery perspective, for people who've heard the hype around him but don't want to put a screen in their sitting room, they were nice paintings as well. So I think a lot of digital artists have perhaps an offering of both.
So with the incredibly fast pace of of technological advancements, nowadays of, that whole entire sector really, not just obviously with AI, how relevant do you see your book being in the future? What sort of changes can you foresee?
It is a good question because it was something that it was a super, I should say it's quite a slim read. It's not a big textbook. And there was a very fast turnaround on it. Because
it's like 30,000 words, isn't it? Yeah, 30,000.
Maybe, I think it's less, 20,000.
20,000, yeah, which is the kind of standard for all of the hot topics in the art world series, which, it's a 20,000 word polemic approach to a topic, which I'm saying this for our listeners who, might be interested in knowing more about the series and why your book fits so well into it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an intro, really. It's laying out. And so obviously, in terms of thinking about the future, it's always hard to predict the future. And I think with tech and with AI, it's particularly hard. So I talk a fair amount about the history of various developments. Like, for example, when talking about how AI might be useful in analysing art market data, I talk first about price databases introduced in the late 80s and how they before you could see auction records, but you had to buy the book. And then you would have to keep the book and know which one to leaf through. And suddenly you could browse all of these price results from years back. Obviously put the collector in a very different position when negotiating with a dealer because they could bring some of this knowledge to that negotiation. And I think that probably did. It certainly would have maybe given more confidence to collectors and perhaps also influenced the dealer's approach. Knowing that. So I try to show how technical changes have brought cultural changes previously. And then I talked a bit about the future. I talked about changes that I saw as relatively inevitable. Again, can't forecast for sure. And then I talked a bit about cultural changes that could happen long term if the art world were to embrace AI. So hopefully, more transparency in the question of authenticity. There's human interests involved because obviously it's very high stakes and it really matters who the author is for the value of the work. So just bringing in methods that don't rely solely on the eye of a connoisseur who's then liable legally to the judgment that they make and the kind of disputes that arise from that. So I guess, I didn't want to come down too hard pro or anti-AI because I'm not. And as a journalist, my interest has been very much watching development, seeing what had hype but didn't end up being a big impact on the art world. What have people's reactions been? So I see myself as an observer more than an advocate either way. But I would say it's broadly optimistic about what the possibilities are long term. But hopefully it will be relevant for time to come. I don't think it's got a really quick sell-by date because it talks about developments more broadly, and I think it's quite future-looking. We spoke to people about how they plan to develop these tools in the next few years, so it's hopefully will be interesting for the next few years at least. But yeah, that's kind of the approach that I took.
Yeah. And I think because you are so well versed in data science, machine learning, in AI, I guess you would naturally be taking an approach that will withstand the test of time as much as you possibly can, because you must be so hyper aware of the fact that like, oh my God, this could be so different in a year, you know? And so, I think it's so interesting. Like if I look back at my bachelor's thesis, I think that's sort of where that question came from, because I was thinking about how relevant or irrelevant some of my statements were. And some of it, you know, because it's taking a more art historical view and a more theoretical approach, that withstands the test of time as well. And so I guess these sorts of things are general conversations that we need to be having that will always be relevant when it comes to thinking about authenticity, when it comes to thinking about creative practice, when it comes to thinking about how we integrate technology within a sector that is so closely tied to human emotion, creation, all of that. So I'm sure that, you know, it will withstand the test of time in all of these ways as well, even if some of the things, you know, in 5 or 10 years will factually, you know, no longer be relevant. What book is? You know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Jo, I have a fun question to end the episode that I ask all of my guests. If you could have dinner with one artist from art history, who would it be and why? It can also be from contemporary times, by the way. It doesn't have to be from art history.
No, it has to be Whistler, not Rex Whistler, John Abbott McNeill Whistler. I think that's all of his names correctly stated. I did a whole course on him at the Courtauld, and it was, I mean, I love his work, but also reading about him, I mean, the quotes were just, his witticisms were at 7 p.m. in the library, your back kind of aching from leaning over a book would, you know, really brighten that study session. His eccentricity, I must say, I think it would be awful if he took against you, like completely mortifying, because I don't think he's one to, you know, pretend to get on with someone that he didn't like. And he's got a very sharp tongue. I don't know if I would like it to be turned on me. But if we got on, I think it would be probably the best dinner I could ever have. So it's worth the risk.
Amazing. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming on the episode or coming on the podcast and contributing to the episode, for sharing your insights. For anyone who is interested in reading the book and buying the book and finding out more about AI and the art market, written by Jo, I'm going to link it in the show notes.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for having me on.
And that is it for today on All About Art. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave me a rating or a review, as it helps more people discover the show. Also, feel free to share with your friends, or if you share on social media, tag me and get in touch. Thank you so much for listening.